Welcome to the Human Dignity by Design podcast, where we explore tech law in context and discuss how law and technology can and should be designed to respect human dignity. My name is Jan Trzaskowski, and I'm here to share research, thoughts, and ideas on tech law and policy, including the role of fundamental human rights as guiding principles in business and beyond. The first 12 episodes of this podcast are an audiobook version of my 2021 book, Your Privacy is Important to Us, which explores how to restore human dignity in data-driven marketing that relies on artificial intelligence. In this episode, you will hear the third chapter of the book, which provides an introduction to law and markets with a particular focus on consumer protection and privacy. Thank you for listening. Chapter 3. Regulating Markets. 1. Law. In Montesquieu's theory concerning the separation of powers, which is reflected in constitutions across the European Union, the main institutions of law include the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Even though there is no single true definition of law, law can be said to regulate behavior in society in a broad sense, including through interpersonal rights and corresponding obligations. Legal persons, such as companies with limited liability and organizations, and natural persons are expected to comply with the law. Law is characterized, in contrast to, for instance, social norms and market forces, by its legal sanctions that can be enforced through the judiciary on the initiative of either the executive, that is on behalf of the people, or a private plaintiff. Written laws, such as legislation and statutory law, may be adopted by the legislature on the basis of a constitution, that is primary law, prescribing limits and procedures for the adoption of such secondary law, which force is derived from the constitution. To use a computer metaphor, constitutions may be perceived as the operating system on which secondary legislation runs. Judge-made law, in the guise of precedents, is also accepted in various degrees, most pronounced in common law countries. EU legislation is primarily based on written law, even though the Court of Justice of the European Union may be perceived as more progressive than some national courts. It follows from Article 19(1) of the Treaty of the European Union that the Court of Justice must ensure that in the interpretation and application of the EU treaties, the law is observed and that member states must provide remedies sufficient to ensure effective legal protection in the fields covered by Union law. 1.1. Regulating human behavior. Human behavior is guided by many rules, including probabilities for various gains and losses in society. In addition to legal norms, which are adopted through a process nested in a constitution, humans are subject to social norms, markets, and architecture, all of which may also influence or be influenced by legal norms. As social norms and markets are likely to influence our behavior, the layout of society, that is the architecture, including computer code, is also likely to influence our behavior in the sense that it may physically restrain our behavior or psychologically lead or nudge us in a particular direction. Thus, law must be understood in a broader regulatory context that also reflects on human nature and society as such. In Part 3, we take a closer look at the role of human behavior and architectures that affect human decision-making. 1.2. Interpretation and assessment. Whenever a court of law is presented with a case, it needs to find a solution by interpreting the law and applying it to a particular set of facts. Even though law is not an exact science, it is, despite its plasticity, not black magic, just because its interpretation and application is not always clear or predictable. One must interpret the law by understanding both its letter and spirit, by means of analyzing the sources of law, that is, the sources from which legal force is derived. Teleological interpretation necessitates that every provision of EU law must be placed in its context and interpreted in the light of the provisions of EU law as a whole, regard being had to the objectives thereof, and to its state of evolution at the date on which the provision in question is to be applied. As noted by the Court of Justice of the European Union in the context of data protection law, the interpretation of a provision of EU law must take account of its wording, the objectives it pursues, its legislative context, the provisions of EU law as a whole, and possibly its origins. Unless there is an express reference to national law, EU law must normally be given an autonomous and uniform interpretation throughout the European Union. In this vein, it is important to distinguish between interpretation and assessments. Roughly speaking, interpretation, eventually carried out by the Court of Justice, provides the content of a rule, whereas assessment is the evaluation of facts necessary to enter a judgment. The Court of Justice may give guidance on assessments that are left to national courts to determine. The margin of discretion left to national courts varies, and the demarcation is not always razor sharp. This is particularly relevant in the context of legal standard used in the GDPR and the UCPD that we discuss in Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 respectively. In many situations, law is ultimately a matter of balancing interests, and to do so properly, we must identify and understand these interests. This is further pursued in Chapter 10 in our discussions of proportionality. 2. Markets. The overarching idea behind market economies like the European Union is that efficient competition, guided by price signals, affected by supply and demand, yields better economic outcomes. One of the particularly interesting assumptions underpinning the market economy is that rational choice theory assumes that consumers make efficient, that is, informed and rational choices based on goals, values, and preferences. It is assumed that these revealed preferences maximizes their welfare. This assumption is pursued and challenged in Chapter 6. There are instances where markets cannot in themselves ensure efficiency. Market failures are situations in which the allocation of goods and services is not efficient, such as when traders' pursuit of pure self-interest lead to results that are not efficient. An important example in this context is the asymmetric power between traders and consumers in the market. Market failures may be corrected by means of market regulation. The field of consumer protection law, as discussed immediately below, seeks to correct the market failure stemming from this asymmetry in power, as further discussed in Chapter 9. The market regulation of the European single market, also the internal market, including consumer protection law, that is to ensure high level of consumer protection, usually has an additional purpose of ensuring efficiency in the market by A. only disturbing it to the extent necessary, and B. removing barriers to interstate trade created by differences in law, that is harmonization. 3. Consumer protection law. In 1962, US President John F. Kennedy presented the following 4 basic consumer rights in a special message to the US Congress. 1. The right to safety, to be protected against the marketing of goods which are hazardous to health or life. 2. The right to be informed, to be protected against fraudulent, deceitful, or grossly misleading information, advertising, labeling, or other practices, and to be given the facts he needs to make an informed choice. 3. The right to choose, to be assured, wherever possible, access to a variety of products and services at competitive prices, and in those industries in which competition is not workable and government regulation is substituted, an assurance of satisfactory quality and service at fair prices. 4. The right to be heard, to be assured that consumer interests will receive full and sympathetic consideration in the formulation of government policies and fair, expeditious treatment in its administrative tribunals. The foundation for EU consumer protection policies was laid out in a resolution from 1975 that followed up on a meeting between heads of state governments held in Paris on 19 to 20 October 1972. It follows that the improvement of the quality of life is one of the tasks of the community, and as such implies protecting the health, safety, and economic interest of the consumer. And it is stated that this task requires a consumer protection and information policy to be implemented at community level, with a view to strengthen and coordinate measures for consumer protection. In the annex to the resolution, consumer interest was summed up by the statement of 5 basic rights in paragraph 3. A. The right to protection of health and safety. B. The right to protection of economic interests. C. The right of redress. D. The right to information and education. And E. The right of representation, that is, the right to be heard. Similarly, the United Nations Guidelines for Consumer Protection now recognize the following legitimate needs, which the guidelines are intended to meet. A. Access by consumers to essential goods and services. B. The protection of vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers. C. The protection of consumers from hazards to their health and safety. D. The promotion and protection of the economic interests of consumers. E. Access by consumers to adequate information to enable them to make informed choices according to individual wishes and needs. F. Consumer education, including education on the environmental, societal, and economic consequences of consumer choice. G. Availability of effective consumer dispute resolution and redress. H. Freedom to form consumer and other relevant groups, organizations, and the opportunity of such organizations to present their views in decision-making processes affecting them. I. The promotion of sustainable consumption patterns. J. A level of protection for consumers using electronic commerce that is not less than that afforded in other forms of commerce. K. The protection of consumer privacy and the global free flow of information. Consumer protection is mentioned in Article 38 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which provides that union policies shall ensure a high level of consumer protection. It also follows from Article 12 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union that consumer protection requirements shall be taken into account in defining and implementing other union policies and activities. Basically, consumer protection law rests on an equation whereby consumers in general are to be protected without interfering too much with the competition that in the end also benefits consumers. As mentioned in Chapter 1, we do not deal with competition, that is antitrust monopoly law. This field of law regulates traders' abuse of market power, and some of the practices may also fall under competition law, but notably only when the trader have sufficient market power. Competition law is also consumer protection law, in the sense that the benefits of efficient markets accrue to consumers. 3.1. Marketing and marketing law. From a trader's perspective, marketing serves the legitimate purpose of influencing consumers' preferences by means of information and conducts, in order to increase profits. Individual traders may, however, have an incentive to present their products and offerings in a light as favorable as possible. Consumers, on the other hand, are interested in finding the products and deals that best suit their goals, values, and preferences. In order to take efficient decisions, consumers must rely on their experience and knowledge, as well as available information, including in particular the trader's marketing. The basis for regulating marketing lies in the market's need for truthful information. The role of marketing law is to ensure that marketing is not carried out in a way that distorts the consumer's ability to make efficient choices, for example, by means of misleading actions, misleading omissions, or aggressive conduct, as we discuss in Chapter 5. Commercial practices that are unfair generate a market failure, as competition is compromised by impairing the consumer's ability to make informed choices. This also gives rise to distortion of competition, because the trader acting unfairly wins business away from competitors who play by the rule. Under the assumption that consumers will read and understand all relevant information, and they will take that information into account when deciding among available products, it is straightforward to use information as a cornerstone of consumer protection policies. This approach is also known as the information paradigm, where information is recognized as the least intrusive and thus the preferred form of market intervention. The information paradigm is challenged in Chapter 9 and goes hand in hand with the consumer's right to self-determination, under which consumers have freedom to choose and also the right to ignore information that traders have provided. This is discussed in Chapter 8. 3.2. Privacy and data protection law. As data protection law is also important for business-to-consumer interaction, the GDPR must, in addition to providing democratic safeguards, be perceived as an important pillar of consumer protection law. The importance of privacy and personal data within consumer law is also recognized by the 2016 amendment of the above-mentioned United Nations Guidelines for Consumer Protection to include consumer privacy. Point E under Principles for Good Business Practices provides that businesses should protect consumers' privacy through a combination of appropriate control, security, transparency, and consent mechanisms relating to the collection and use of their personal data. Of the original 5 basic consumer rights in the European Union, the processing of personal data may in our context be most closely connected to the protection of economic interests, as the most common use of personal data in a business context relates to the marketing of products. When considering developments within data-driven business models and the above-mentioned harm identified by the Center for Humane Technology, more rights come into play. Issues concerning digital addiction and mental health may fall under health and safety, which together with superficiality may undermine the aim of information and education. The rights of redress and representation may be challenged by the market power of big tech, which exercises significant power when it comes to deciding which information is disseminated to whom. This broader perspective is pursued in Chapter 10. Political marketing does not fall under consumer protection law, but creating addiction and engagement to sustain a platform for both commercial and political marketing does. This service or platform that relies on third-party marketing is the relevant commercial product offered to consumers. As we will explore in the following chapters, both data protection law and marketing law share the aim of empowering individuals, including through information that is meant to establish transparency. A significant difference between the two areas of law is that marketing law aims to protect consumers in commercial markets, and data protection law pursues the aim of protecting the privacy of citizens, including in their capacity as consumers. Privacy, including the protection of personal data, is a fundamental right, that is primary law, that reaches beyond mere market regulation. Few EU laws have attracted as much popular and global attention as the GDPR, and it constitutes a significant strengthening of consumer protection law, as it also requires legitimacy and accountability, as discussed in Chapter 4. When it was introduced, a lot of attention was paid to the significant fines of up to 4% of global annual turnover. A similar approach to penalties was introduced to EU marketing law with the new Consumer Deal Directive, but notably only for enforcement measures in coordinated actions. For penalties in general under the UCPD, member states must lay down national penalties that are effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. This is supplemented with non-exhaustive and indicative criteria that must be taken into account for the imposition of penalties where appropriate. As we deal with data protection law from a consumer protection perspective, the term user, consumer, citizen, and data subject are used interchangeably. The same is true for service provider, trader, and data controller. Thank you for joining the Human Dignity by Design podcast, where we explore tech law in context. In the next episode, you can listen to the 4th chapter of Your Privacy is Important to Us, which is an introduction to privacy and data protection law. Music for this podcast is composed and performed by Thomas Roh. My name is Jan Trzaskowski.